You're listening to WCOM LP 103.5 FM Carborough and Chapel Hill. It's a Tuesday, it's 5 o'clock, and that only means one thing. It's time for another round of Snarky Faith with your host, Stuart Deloney. This is a space where we irreverently wrestle through life, culture, and spirituality, all with our heads in the clouds, our tongues in our cheeks, our hearts in our sleeves, and our feet on the ground. At Snarky Faith, the questions or even the answers are never the point. It's all about the conversation. So here's your host, Stuart Deloney.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to another round of Snarky Faith Radio. I'm your host, Stuart Deloney. And you know what? Mama always said we're not supposed to speak ill of the dead, but apparently I didn't listen to Mama. So yes, uber, super, mega evangelist Billy Graham has died. And I'm supposed to sit here and reminisce about his wonderful legacy. But you are listening to a show called Snarky Faith Radio, and sorry, that's not going to happen. So once I got news that Reverend Graham had passed away, I was having a conversation with my wife, and she asked me this poignant question. She's like, you know, we've always kind of been raised to think of him almost in like idol status. But how did we get Franklin Graham out of Billy Graham? And that was a question I really started to scratch my head about because a little bit of my past history, you know, growing up Southern Baptist, I remember when I was in my teens that our church got wind that Billy Graham was going to be doing one of his last crusades. So we had to book tickets. My parents wanted me to go and see Billy Graham for one of the last times I'd be able to have that opportunity. So churches like ours, which was a very large church in the Atlanta area, and many other churches took busloads upon busloads upon busloads of people to fill the Georgia Dome so we could go listen to Dr. Graham speak. The only thing that when I was like 15, I was processing through, Billy Graham is an evangelist. I'm already saved. Most of us in the church that are going are already saved. Why are we going to an evangelistic rally when we're all saved? So that was like one of my first kind of tastes of Billy Graham and wondering, what the hell are we doing here? Because even though you have a bunch of Christians already filling the Georgia Dome, when he gives an altar call, most of them go down to recommit their lives to Jesus because somehow doing it under Billy Graham makes it super special, makes it super recommitted because God cares about these things. No, it was just Christian weirdness. And flash forward to years later when I am a young into my career working for ministry, I'd gone to the Catalyst Conference, which is a conference for pastors and Christian leaders in the Atlanta area. This is back when they only had it on one coast. And I remember they were giving a legacy award to Franklin Graham. And Franklin Graham goes on to tell the story of how he took over the Billy Graham Association. And he begins to talk about how his father had done all of this over the years. And what I found odd was he begins to say in this story, which is supposed to be heartwarming, that apparently the Billy Graham Association had pretty much had the same operating budget over the years and didn't really increase it. So when they would do rallies around the world, they kind of kept within budget, which is not a bad thing. And when Franklin took over, he started looking at their books and he started realizing they had like millions of dollars in surplus. And as Franklin Graham told the rest of us, well, the best thing we decided to do was to go to poorer nations and begin to buy airwave space and show old Billy Graham rallies, revivals, preachings, whatever you want to call them. And so they had this huge surplus. They weren't going to go and use it to serve the poor, help those that were needy. No. They were going to buy airspace to show black and white Billy Graham evangelistic rallies. And again, early in my faith, and especially earlier in my ministry career, I found that kind of odd. I kind of questioned myself, going, what's going on here with this? Stepping forward a few years also, when I was working for an evangelistic organization, we would all speak of Billy Graham in high terms, high praise for Dr. Graham. But what began to mess with my head was he really pushed forward this kind of easy evangelism, really this kind of get out of hell insurance, that all you need to do is get saved. Now, we're not going to worry about discipleship or really understanding what it means to be a Christian. No. All we really care about is just being able to count those that were being saved, because evangel. I can't even bring myself to say this. Evangelical Christianity was so obsessed with converts, they really didn't care about anything else. And then really kind of digging back in to looking into Billy Graham's legacy, especially to answer that question for my wife in a way that was informed more than just snarky and off the cuff, I began to see a man that was consistently on the wrong side of history. Because traditionally, before his rise to notoriety, the kind of evangelical MO was to pull away from culture, was to pull away from society, was to really just focus on your flock and hopefully embodying Christianity and the kingdom of God the way it was supposed to be embodied in those areas. But what began to move forward was this embracing of political action, which then led towards the moral majority rising with the religious right, the focus on the family, folks. Oh, so much fun. And as I dug deeper and deeper, I began to see more and more how Dr. Graham was on the wrong side of history within LGBTQ rights, civil rights. And he was one of the biggest ones to push end times conversations and end times insanity. And then we began to see how the evangelical Christianity turned into being something that was xenophobic, that was nationalistic. The same thing that led us to Trump. Billy Graham was anti-climate change. And so I'll just leave these nuggets with you right now, because I've heard oftentimes the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I know this isn't a popular viewpoint for me to be mentioning as someone has just died. But I don't want Christianity to get caught up in his legacy without seeing the dark side of Billy Graham's legacy as well. So thank you for indulging me within that little snarky aside. But the meat of our episode today is going to come from a chat I had with author and advocate Kirt Lewis. And I think you're going to enjoy it. So let's go ahead and get straight to it, because we're pressed for time today. So onward to our interview with Kirt Lewis. Well, I'm sitting here with Kirt Lewis, who is an advocate and an author. And I met Kirt through a roundabout method of social media and friends and all the other kind of stuff. But it's always interesting when you kind of end up meeting people and you kind of feel like you already know them right off the bat. You know, you end up meeting them and they're not a stranger right away. And they're kind of like, dude, like, yeah, I get you. You get me. This is great. So Kirt, thank you so much for sitting down with me today.
Thanks, Stuart.
And so, yeah, I met Kirt through another one of my friends, Chris Kratzer, and it was I guess buddy at first, buddy at first Facebook, maybe. Is that how it works? And it is an amazing thing to kind of find kinship through the virtual space and the virtual world. And so I want to do here for like the time that we have is I want to unpack your story a little bit, and also. For you, Kirt, I want to also give you any ability that you want to shamelessly promote your website, which is Kirt, K-I-R-T, Lewis.com, KirtLewis.com.
Close. There's an E in the middle.
It's Kirt
really
E. Lewis.
Yeah, there we go.
So, okay. Thank you. So it'll be Kirt E. Lewis,
kirt.com, but all smashed together. And Kirt is a writer and a podcaster, and I just wholeheartedly recommend his your deep dives you do into subjects, and also your musings on pop culture and other things of that. I love it, and I think my listeners will love it as well too. So Kirt, give me the elevator speech for everybody else. What is the elevator speech on Kirt, and then we'll dig deeper than the elevator speech.
Sure. Well, so a big part of my journey, of course, has been being born into the evangelical faith tradition, with the strengths and weaknesses associated with that. I've had a couple of amazing parents that I've no doubt have a tremendous personal experience and a strong faith in walking with Jesus, and that was a big part. It was a hugely formational experience growing up. Also related to that, my parents were group home managers for ladies with developmental disabilities for over 30 years. So I would say that a unique value for those in our communities who are often marginalized or misplaced is something that runs very deep in the veins of the Lewis family. And so I think that to a large extent was passed on to me. So this combination of growing up in an environment where faith was front and center and foundational, and expressed in very tangible ways, of loving what some might refer to as the unlovable, or the people that are just lost and forgotten in the mix. Those are hugely formational. So yet at the same point in time, a big part of my journey has also been discovering to what extent the faith tradition that I was a part of, in some ways, discouraged faith, and how do I break free from that and recover kind of a childlike faith that I think that we're called to have and to live out. So that, but prior to that led to, I often, and in a couple of places, I'll refer to the Apostle Paul when he talks about, his pedigree, and I also have kind of the evangelical pedigree of having been born and raised in that church, attended a couple of evangelical schools, Bible college and seminary. So I went the ministry route. Ended up serving as a pastor for 17 years. In the midst of that, I had a very interesting detour that usually surprises people, and that was, you could kind of call me a 9/11 enlistee. I was serving as a youth pastor in the Bay Area when 9/11 happened, and I ended up leaving ministry temporarily and spent a couple of years in the Army. That led me overseas, did a tour of duty in Iraq, came back, and then re-entered more the traditional ministry context. But what I found over my years of serving as a pastor is that I felt like more and more I'd become a dispenser of religious goods and services, and I found myself extremely discouraged and discontent with where I was, and kind of in a season of in that season made an interesting connection and started doing some work with Wold Relief, which is an international humanitarian organization, faith-based humanitarian organization, actually serves under the umbrella of the National Association of Evangelicals. So it aligned with kind of that tradition that I was familiar with and trained and been working in, but then redirected my energies and efforts towards another marginalized, mistreated, misplaced population, and that would be immigrants and refugees. So, and I didn't know what impact that new change, I should say, would have on my life. It was interesting that I transitioned into that role, and then just a few years later is when immigrants and refugees in particular became very front and center in the political conversation and landscape. And I found myself in the awkward position of being a strong advocate, but amongst a community that overwhelmingly, as most people are aware, voted and sided with a politician that was, in my opinion, spreading all kinds of lies and misinformation. And so all of that coming full circle to a point where I realized that maybe the issues with the tradition that I had been born and raised in ran deeper. And this is really the short version of it, but ultimately made a decision to leave that tradition. And so I'm kind of in a place where, I'm rediscovering and in some ways trying to unlearn things that I need to unlearn and find Jesus again, kind of in the mix of all that. Hopefully that's a long rambling answer, but that's a little bit of my life journey in a nutshell.
Nah, it's a beautiful answer within all of that. And one thing I wanted to ask you about, because you'd mentioned this, there's two different terms I've heard you say in our conversation so far, is that the evangelicals seem to discourage faith. So tell me a little more about that. Unpack that statement.
It's actually something I'm going to be doing some more writing and podcasting on soon. Is a little bit of these distinguishing trademarks between faith and religion, as I'm kind of using those terms, and that's the blog category that I'm writing under that really address these issues. And that is that I think that a fundamental characteristic of faith is one of exploration. I told somebody else the other day who was reading one of my posts and messaged me on Facebook, and she was just like, I've just been reading this, and we went to the same Bible college together and all this, and she's like, I was crying. And I think it's because, and I told her, I said, you want to know what my creed is now? I believe in the question mark. I think that there's something profound that if I understand the little that I do understand about God, it's that he's so much bigger than what I already understand now. And why would I not have an inquisitive, open mind? And how is that not a part of faith, is this unknown that we are exploring, but yet trusting? And so that's, I think, where in contrast, religion tends to be focused on preserving and protecting what little we do know. It's all about dogma and creeds as we typically understand them, which is ironic because you would think, as somebody coming out of broadly the Protestant tradition, you would think that deep in the roots of that is this rebellion against those kind of hard and fast categories. But I found that to be not true within the evangelical tradition. And so it leaves very little room for inquiry, open inquiry, and asking questions. And I think that is tremendously important to a vital faith.
No, I think you're right about that, especially when you begin to think about even like what the definition of faith. It's about experiencing something that's unknown or unseen. And when you begin to think about those waters of religion, it's more about a control structure. Yeah. It's like you'd mentioned a dogma. It's, to be part of our tribe, you need to know X, Y, and Z. And if you don't either believe or measure up to X, Y, and Z, you probably don't have a place here. And this whole idea of the mystery of God and the mystery of faith and the fact that there is things that we don't know is something that makes it very problematic, I think, for an institutionalized system. Because an institutionalized system tells us we have to have all the answers. Like if you're the pastor, you have to have all the answers. You can't have any doubts because you're selling a product. Yeah. And so often it ends up being like that. And the sad matter of fact with it is that those control structures cause so much damage to people and cause so much harm because oftentimes, like you've done this, like contrasting faith and religion, because Jesus was a person that spoke about faith. When Jesus was painting pictures of the kingdom of God, this was something that was yet to come. It was here now and also yet to come. And again, when you look at those things, there's an openness There's an openness. There's a journey forward. There's a, yeah, I get this, but there's also a whole lot more to get.
Yeah.
And sometimes if we're trying to control people, that's a lot more difficult to wrap that around. So we just need to say, I know this, that's it.
Yeah. And it is ultimately, when we do operate that way. And if I'm being honest, I mean, I felt like I did have to be an answer man for a lot of my life. And yeah, I think whenever anybody shares ideas, they're sharing their thoughts on what they think they know. I get that. And I share a lot of my thoughts on what I think I know, but I try to hold on to that loosely, and hopefully in humility and conversation with others, particularly others who are different from me. I think that's where I'm finding a real vital faith in the midst of all that. So, but what I was going to say is really the contrast, or the opposite to that, is really a form of worship, and it's a form of idolatry, where we have elevated our ability to comprehend a vast universe and a vast God, and yet somehow break it down all into bite-sized pieces that then we demand others conform to and adhere to without any sense of humility. And I think that's a telltale sign of religion or Phariseeism. And I have personally come to the conclusion that it's something that's so pervasive within the evangelical tradition that it's with very few exceptions is it going to be reformed. So
no, you're right about that. It ends up being a cancer to faith. It ends up being this whole antithesis of it, to where it inhibits this journey that you look towards. And you've mentioned, I don't know if you said it on the air, but you said it to me before, and I know you state in your writings that you're a recovering evangelical. And so being a recovering evangelical, was there a moment or a time that led you out, or is it more of a mosaic of experiences?
Probably a little bit more of a mosaic. It was kind of connecting the dots. Maybe some things, I kind of, after I had some realizations that I went back in time, kind of as best as I could. And it's like, oh, I can see where these elements of religion, as I was describing it, were more dominant than maybe I wanted to admit. But I would say that, generally speaking, in my role when I was serving as the director of the Sacramento Field Office of World Relief, and World Relief, one of 9 NGOs that has worked cooperatively with the State Department for, almost 40 years in helping to receive and resettle refugees. And when I saw the apathy or antagonism, overwhelmingly so, and there was some exceptions to that, but when I saw predominantly apathy or antagonism towards refugees from the evangelical tradition, and I was a front and center leader in that effort and was engaged in difficult dialogue with other evangelical leaders, and I saw the choices that they were largely making, with a few exceptions. That was a pretty that shook things up for me, and really caused some pretty deep reflection upon what it was, whatever tribe I was affiliated with, and did this really reflect? I mean, I think that's the question I was really asking. Wait a minute, at what point when you're a part of a community do you say the beliefs, the values, the behaviors, there's no longer a critical mass of some consensus, not uniformity, but at least some consensus around some things? It's like, yeah, I think we hold these things in common, and that's what brings us together, and we work together. At what point is that critical consensus not there anymore? And then what I am is I'm just I'm constantly fighting, and it just didn't seem like it was good for me. It probably wasn't all that pleasant for them. And I felt like more and more, I felt the pressure to not be myself and be honest. And I made the decision that I had to put myself in a place or in a space where I can be ruthlessly honest, both with myself as well as with others.
Well, when you're beginning to talk about this, and I know you're saying, especially when you're talking about concepts like, refugee resettlements and, even especially more currently, which has been in the news a lot, this idea, of immigration and feeling a pushback from the evangelical church. What is your best way of articulating from put back your evangelical hat on? I know you've tried to throw it out and and put it on the street. So speak from their party. What are their issues when it comes to like refugees and immigration?
Yeah. Well, I think that you do hear some language or obviously things you'll often hear are about security, safety. You'll hear about fears or concerns of a cultural, biblical worldview driven, which I think is a little bit, it's hard for me to not take my hat off and say that's pretty amusing. But some that, there's this, we need to preserve our American way of life and things of that nature. And somehow that gets all infused with, in my opinion, a warped understanding of the scriptures. But those are things that we have, typically heard of is preservation, fear of certainly of not only a violent, people can think of. I understand the fear of violence. I mean, obviously, as somebody who spent a couple years in the Army and did a tour of duty in Iraq, I understand fear when, somebody might think that their life feels threatened. Now, I think that there's perceived fears and then there's actual fears. But I think that preserving what is, is probably the driving force in all this. So yeah.
And what ends up
yeah, I'm just gonna slightly shift if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll take a note.
Make a time note there.
Yeah. No worries.
All right. Is this just an audio podcast?
Yeah. I'm not recording. I'm not recording the video.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah.
So we have no continuity issues. Like what? What happened?
Yeah.
1 second. Let me think about
it.
Yeah. Okay. So do you think that with all that you said within that, what ends up coming back to me over and over again with the evangelical church in America, a lot of it comes back to comfort. Is that Christians in America don't want to be uncomfortable. They want to go to churches that do not challenge them. They want a faith that's easy. They want a faith that's more kind of psychobabble. Like what are like the 5 ways to make life easier, or the 5 ways to, I don't know, make sure I've got more fiber in my diet. I mean, it's all kind of BS like that. And
it sounds like, a lot of people have referred to kind of the self-help gospel.
Yeah.
And I think that that's fair. And I mean, that's why, one of my more recent thoughts that I wrote down was trying to articulate these various idols of evangelicalism. And one of them was comfort. And I think that's the irony about it for me, is that if you wanted a comfortable life, if that was the overriding value, then Jesus is probably the worst savior you can pick. Everything I understand about him doesn't sound very comfortable. When he uses as an analogy what would be his own physical experience of literally taking up a cross and saying, I want you to do the same and follow me, that does not sound comfortable. And it is a direct affront and challenge. And I think that's probably what I ultimately landed on is, there's things that people, including myself, we say it all the time. Sometimes we deceive ourselves. We'll say that, hey, I believe in this. there's stated beliefs and values, and then there's actual beliefs and values.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the where you can find the actual beliefs and values ultimately will be evidenced in people's behaviors.
Yeah.
So I spend a lot of time looking at this beliefs, values, and behaviors. And so, and what I see, for the most part, and I'm trying to be, compassionate in all of this because I'm generalizing, because I know of amazing men and women and that are engaged within that tradition still, that are doing tremendous work, and but they feel out of place. Mm-hmm. And so I think that just underscores that there's some very profound issues within the American evangelical tradition, and I do focus specifically on that because I have good friends who are a part, I would say, of the evangelical tradition in other parts of the world. Part of my role and my work with World Relief led to a role that I'm still functioning in, where I serve as I serve on the Global Leadership Council for something called the Refugee Highway Partnership. And so that's a global network of Christian churches and organizations that are working with forcibly displaced peoples. So in that particular role, and as a facilitator for the co-facilitator for the North America region, I interact with people from a pretty wide array of backgrounds and geographies. And I was posing this very question actually just a few weeks ago to a couple of friends of mine. And I said, what's the difference between Canadian evangelicalism and American evangelicalism?
Isn't it just saying Jesus, eh?
Yeah, Jesus. Yeah, exactly.
No, I don't know. I'm sorry, that was bad. Keep going.
No, it's true, and it was an interesting conversation, because there were certain elements of which they were distinct, but there was also some other elements in which they were very much in common, which I think speaks to maybe some more profound, foundational issues that I might have some issues with. So.
No, but you're right, and I think that's an important thing to point out. But I think for longtime listeners of our show, they know that one of our favorite skewering points is more or less American Christianity, and especially speaking of this in a way that this is not Christianity globally speaking. Because we in America have to go and kind of make it our own way and screw it up. Because of consumerism, capitalism, materialism, and a lot of other isms in the midst of all of that. But I think that what's fascinating, and you were kind of touching on this, is that oftentimes what I've noticed over working for like a broad spectrum of churches in America, like, is that I feel like to many people Christianity has become more of almost like a philosophy than it has been a way of life. A philosophy meaning like there's just a set of ideals I have in my head, or a set of ideas that I have. Oh, I like these. These are good. But a lot of times, I have friends, and they're not insulted because I've told this all of this to their face before, is that oftentimes most of the people that have like philosophy majors that I know, they are great at sitting around and talking. But then I'll say, so what does all this mean? I don't know. It's just really interesting. And I need to like read some more about this. And it ends up just being in the nebulous of their brains. And I feel like Christianity has a comfort zone being in the nebulous of your brain. But the difference begins to happen when you begin to walk it out. And like you'd mentioned even earlier about this idea of, it's simple, Jesus saying, pick up your cross daily. And I think for many people, well, that just means I'm wearing a cross necklace, right? That's like literally the same thing you're saying, right? Yeah, I do that every day. And, missing the entire point that faith has to be tied to action, and it has to be tied to what you're doing day in and day out. And if you when I hear all these people, especially political people that like to use Jesus, or use scripture, they're just using it as a sounding board. They're using it as leverage to get votes. But it's really just a bunch of nothingness. I mean, it sounds good, but you don't see anything come of that.
Yeah, isn't it? It's interesting that when you're reading through the book of Acts, that the way was one of the first, identifiers, the first handles of this group of people who followed Jesus. They were a part of the way. And instead, it seems like institutionalized Christianity, and I might say that probably would be true for any institutionalized religion, that over time it becomes more of the idea. Like I hold to the idea instead of the way. And the way, provides or the way conjures up images of movement, of walking, of actual physical activity, of willpower, of trust, and it seems like in institutionalized, we're talking of evangelical Christianity, but I have good friends who are of other faith groups, and I think they would probably say that there seems to be a little bit of a pattern there in terms of any institutionalized religion, is where over time you move towards more and more a preservation of comfort and an elevation of ideas over action and lifestyle.
Yeah, I think things like that. Even within organizations, corporate organizations, it ends up kind of becoming more of a memorial, to the glory days of past. It becomes about, Yeah, I mean, even in a dumb manner. I mean, we continue to see different like iterations of with KFC. We have to have like a new kernel every week, and ultimately, I look at this. I'm like, I don't even care about the kernel. Again, I don't really eat at KFC, so maybe I'm not their target marketing group. But they keep pushing this idea, and I'm like, I really don't think anybody gives two craps about the kernel or who's playing the kernel or anything else like that. Just make good chicken and continue to do that. But you're memorializing the past, I guess, was my long rambling point for that. And so I think you have an interesting perspective too, especially since you've served in the military. We've recently had yet another school shooting in America, another tragedy, and we continue to see politicians and thoughts and prayers and all this other BS that kind of comes out of that. How do you conceptualize this? Like, how do you see this from your lens, your viewpoint, and what do you say after these events in your own head?
Well, I think there's some continuity to some of the things that we were just talking about, and that is going past ideas to action. We live in an era where easy activism is rampant, where I can, we have this incredibly short attention span as a society, and then that's and then we somehow convince ourselves that by just saying, how angry we are about something and the change that we want to see on social media, that somehow we've made a great sacrifice to improve our society and move things forward. And so, I think that at the very least, this should inspire action more than just words, especially when you see a repeated pattern over and over and over again with great tragic effect. At some point in time, this is a big part of, at some point in time, it's the old analogy of do you stay downriver and you just continue to nurse and attend to the bodies that are floating down the river, or do you go upstream and you say there's got to be something that we can do here to begin to address this at a higher level and limit. I mean, this world's a broken place. I get it. People will find a way to do bad things and hurt each other. But there is, in my mind, some very common sense, reasonable steps that can be taken to significantly reduce the likelihood of this kind of firepower ending up in the hands of people who are obviously mentally, psychologically not well, and are apt to carry out and in a much more profound way their violent thoughts because of the ability that they have to access the kind of weapons that I would think would only be reserved for people when you speak of my military experience. In that realm, though. I'll tell you right now, I also have that could springboard into a whole other conversation, because my thoughts and views on war and violence have changed quite a bit over the years. Gone are the John Wayne-esque glorified pictures of what that actually results in, and in its place are the end results of a lot of devastated lives. And so anything that we can do to move away from violence and giving people access to the ability to carry out those acts of violence with weapons like these, it's high time that we address them. I reject the thoughts that you'll hear where people will say, "Oh, this isn't the time to ask questions." That's incredibly insensitive to those who have suffered. I highly doubt that those who have suffered would mind us stopping and asking and saying that we have to address this as a society, so that we don't end up with more widows and orphans, and there's enough of that already in this world. So I'm hoping that we can continue to take some steps to address access to this crazy amount of firepower that some people are getting, carrying out in our schools. And again, it's kind of interesting, again, as I talked about earlier about perceived versus actual threats. The irony, as I was doing my work predominantly with refugees, was hearing about all this fear-mongering about refugees, and then looking at the reality of how often Americans kill Americans, far more often than the people that were being scapegoated. Much like the same thing with undocumented immigrants today. Same kind of thoughts. It's an easy way. It's a convenient way for us to go back to another one of Jesus's famous sayings. It's an easy way for us to nitpick while we have a log in our eye, right? With to remove the small thorn in somebody else's flesh. So.
So on that, so we're going to kind of hit a little bit of a lightning round, if you can handle this. Okay. So right now, when you think about American culture, and I'll get to church culture in a moment. So when you kind of think about American culture, the nice way of me saying this, currently now, what grieves you the most about America? Like, what are your top 3 things that are grieving you about America? My less eloquent way would saying, what are the 3 things that piss you off about America right now?
Yeah, well, number 1 would be the wholesale pragmatism and embrace of a political leader who is, in my opinion, is fundamentally dishonest and corrupt. So that's this might not be in order, but it's just what comes to my mind. But that certainly is one of them.
How dare you, sir? We hold Donald Trump with a very high regard on the show.
I'm sorry, but
I'm sorry. Keep going.
Yeah, 2 would be the continued broad exploitation of an entire racial, ethnic group, and that would be undocumented immigrants. The scapegoating that's going on there is pretty maddening, given the actual experience of people, fellow human beings, and the sacrifices they're making in many ways, so that I could have cheaper groceries and pay less next time I go to Disney World, because the housekeeping is a lot less expensive. So all of those things, that's probably another issue. And then probably somewhat related to this, and I think this is actually probably a criticism that where there could be room for some bipartisan critique is that we have, everybody's about posturing. Everybody, we have lost an ability to have reasonable conversation. Everybody's trying to take the most strategic route so that they could end up on top in the conversation and stay in a position of influence and power. And I think that culturally, more broadly and culturally, we've lost. And I'm saying this is a confession too, because I feel like I need to relearn a whole new way of thinking about how I relate to people who are different than me, and have meaningful conversations with them. So that's what I would probably say is, we have, we've our embrace of corrupt leadership, our exploitation of entire, ethnic, racial groups. I've mentioned undocumented immigrants, but I still think that there, of course, are other racial groups that continue to be oppressed systemically, carrying on in a legacy, an unfortunate legacy that we've had in the history of this nation. And then thirdly, would be the loss of, civility and like reasonable, humble public discourse.
No, you're right about that. I feel like the idea of dialogue is dead, and it's more about keeping score now, and that is a sad state. So similarly, when we think about American Christianity, or whatever that is that we call it is, but whatever the state of it is, what do you think are the top 3 things that are hindering American Christianity from actually looking like the faith, the way of life, the kingdom of God that Jesus was laying out?
So I think that what we talked about earlier, comfort, is, and the strong desire to preserve the least costly form of faith. I would say second to that would be our confusion of the survival of that faith with institutional preservation. This is where I've often wondered, if I were to get really radical, I just wonder at some point in time, it seems like whenever the faith gets in trouble, as soon as there is payroll, property, property, and political influence. It's like when we somehow confuse those, and those become dominant factors, it just begins to erode the heart of faith, of the Christian faith I'm speaking of in this context. Yeah, it's like politics, property, and payroll.
So after all that we've talked about, what is one thing? And I don't want the Jesus-y answer. I'm not saying you would, but there's the easy Jesus cop-out answer. But when we've talked about just the state of the American Christianity, we've talked about the state of America as a whole. What is something that is giving you hope right now?
Well, I think something that's giving me hope is finding others who are making decisions to break outside of the relational communities that they have been kind of focused on. So I think that I'm finding some hope in individuals who are are just saying like I want to question, and I want to be a part of um, of a conversation with people where I can truly be open and honest. So I know that's that's kind of general and vague, but I do think it is hopeful. I think that you see this maybe on a very large scale with human beings, is even on a society level, that we go through patterns and in times in which we're gravitating towards comfort and predictability.
Mm-hmm.
And then a discontent starts to form, and people decide to just say, it's like, okay, now it's time to break out of that, and it's time to explore really something new, and to think creatively about who we are and what we can be. And I'm in.
Oh no.
Enjoying.
Yeah,
Hello?
you're back. Yes. So and
Back?
yeah. So yeah, finish your thought. Yeah, I don't know why Skype. Yeah.
So maybe that's a little bit of a silver lining to what's been kind of a discouraging and depressing season at a period of time, and seeing the hate and the fear rise and take positions of power. Is, I think, in the midst of that also, it has kind of awakened the masses out of their stupor and said, well, we have to deal and address with things at a deeper level, and we want to think creatively and have imagination of where we want to go in the future in a way that leads to the kind of community or society that embraces a way of love. So I think I'm encouraged by some of that in all the midst of this. I'm trying to think of some other things that I might be encouraged by, but that's the number one thing that pops into my mind.
Oh, excellent, excellent. So for our listeners that have listened to this and say, I want more of Kirt. Kirt, how should they find you? I know you've got your website,
Yes.
Kirt E Lewis.
Thank you.
Not Kirt E Lewis, KIRTE Lewis,
Yeah.
LEWIS.com. Do you want to be reached on other social
I
media
better
realms?
say, yeah, I better say. So I mean, the E is just literally my middle initial. So there's
Okay.
I wish I had a really, cool, sexy web address, but it's not. It's literally my first, last, and middle initial. So, but that's probably the best place that they can go there, and through that website, they'll also, you can see links to Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, in which I sometimes will share some additional thoughts, or if they want to stay in the loop, and that's a great way to do that. And you can reach out through those platforms to myself. I'd love to be in conversation with people who, like we talked about, are exploring or recovering a sense of dialogue and conversation. And I also want to be clear that I want it to be with people who come from different backgrounds and perspectives. I don't want to end up creating an echo chamber of myself. But as long as there is, I think, ability to love and push through our differences, and a willingness to go through kind of the tunnel of chaos together, those are the kind of people I think I want to surround myself with and grow from.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
So thanks so much to Kirt for being on the show today. And I'm going to leave you with this. I know we had a past episode talking about the gun debate that's going on in America, especially in the wake of the high school shooting in Florida. And just yesterday, President Trump, when he was speaking to America's governors, laid out this little nugget that somehow will help us on the road to thinking through gun control as a country. Let me read this to you. It's too good. It's too snarky for me to leave before we leave the show. So yes, Trump had told us that He said this, quote, "I really believe I'd run in there, even if I didn't have a weapon. And I think most of the people in this room would have done that too." Oh boy, I'd love to see. Like, that's wrong for so many reasons. A, I don't think his fat ass can run at all. And secondly, him doing something selfless? What? What is that? That's not even possible. Well, as we end this broadcast, just a final reminder that you can catch us on podcasts at www.snarkyfaith.com. And thank you so much for joining us this hour. And I send you off with snark and grace and peace. Have a wonderful week. We'll catch you again next week.
God bless the United States. Thank you very much. United States.
WCOM is listener-supported community radio, and Snarky Faith is only possible through our sponsors. Lumen, a spiritual community of seekers, sojourners, question askers, doubters, and skeptics, is a collective of fellow travelers that embrace the truth that all of life is sacred, hope is real, and tomorrow can be a better day than today. All are welcome. You can find more information at www.lumencommunities.com.